and we'll move on to the carrying on of the submission. So I'd like to invite Victoria Andrews to come forward. Now, you've got an individual submission, then a Akaroa Civic Trust submission, and then Mike Norris. So do you want to run them all together? And yeah, absolutely fine by me. Great.
And I'd like to thank you for the opportunity of addressing my submission today. And I'd like to introduce Mike Norris, who's the chairman of the Akaroa Civic Trust. And our submissions do merge and overlap a lot, so I'll start off. I support the representation of Banks Peninsula in the review, and I would like to address various points regarding peninsula boundaries, wards, and representation in greater detail. But first, I'd like to take you on a walk down memory lane. In 2000, 63% of Christchurch residents voted against amalgamation with Banks Peninsula. So a second attempt was made by a group of Littleton businessmen joined by a former mayor of Akaroa. They launched a plan to abolish Banks Peninsula District Council, and Christchurch residents had no say in the matter, so the abolition was successful in 2006. Two distinctly different districts merged, joined at the hip in an arranged marriage. Christchurch gained control over what it considered to be its rural playground and backyard without understanding the needs, aspirations, and difficulties that isolated rural communities experience on a daily basis. Christchurch took over, and after the MOU expired, the top-heavy bureaucracy applied its standard one-size-fits-all policy on Banks Peninsula on the ward. Christchurch had no idea about the condition of the peninsula's infrastructure and lack of maintenance, nor did it understand how few resources are readily available to remote communities. Akaroa has no shopping mall and very few gathering places. We are fortunate to have a petrol station and a local Foursquare. The BNZ closes on May 28th, and the nearest bank is a 90-minute drive into the city, which costs about $30 to $40 or more in petrol. And our part-time dentist is not available due to health problems, so we now have no dentist. The Local Government Commission stated in 2005 in the abolition decision that it was satisfied the merger would, quote, promote good local government, end quote. In legislation, promote means to advance, help forward, enhance, or improve. The Commission felt the Council had appropriate expertise to address the concerns of ratepayers. Akaroa residents have raised questions and challenged Council policies that were created for an urban metropolitan area from being imposed on rural communities, resulting in some of us being viewed as being ungrateful. Having said that, I would like to acknowledge the Council's purchase of the Red House property because it is a nationally significant site in the context of the Takapunaki Historic Reserve, so I'd like to say thank you to all of you. Our representation has declined within the Council structure, and if the ward were merged with another, it would be reduced even further. The Holswell Residents Association representative on Monday expressed concern about the peninsula's receiving special treatment. He said that contractors provide public transport, and for your information, the cost of a shuttle is around $50, and the timetable is designed for tourists with scenic stops along the way. The shuttle departs Akaroa at 4 p.m. and returns the next day, which requires staying overnight in Christchurch. I do not regard this as being public transport. For diverse communities of interest, areas such as Cashmere, Ferrymead, Linwood, and Maribel are not isolated because they are suburbs within Christchurch. Isolated communities on the peninsula means that we often have to rely on an active spring, as we do, for drinking water. Communities in Christchurch do not have to contend with dead possums contaminating their water supply, nor do they have to drive 75 kilometers to buy a pair of work boots, go to the dentist, bank, or hospital. City suburbs do not experience power outages on a regular basis that can last 5 hours. Isolated communities and ratepayers on the peninsula must drive 90 minutes to 2 hours to make a dash to the airport or Christchurch hospital, provided, that is, that Highway 75 is not closed to bad weather, which sometimes stops the Westpac helicopter from reaching Akaroa to pick up emergency patients. Welcome to our world. This is what it takes to live in an isolated community of interest. If the city does not understand the basic elements of life in isolated peninsula communities after 16 years, then there is a serious representation and communication problem in my view. Peninsula ratepayers enjoy access to large supermarkets, dentists, banks, and an excellent library and a fully functioning service center in Holswell. But the similarities between the two wards stops right there. The following is an example of peninsula representation. The decision to close the Akaroa Service Center excluded the Banks Peninsula Community Board, nor were the board told that the closure was part of the LTP process. The draft LTP revealed plans to remove the citizens' desk at the end of the 6-month trial period, terminating all face-to-face service. Details of the action were not made available in community board agendas, which instead provided carefully crafted reports containing limited information. Topics such as this that impact the community in a very strong manner would be lost in the shuffle if Banks Peninsula merged into Holswell with one combined councillor and perhaps 2 community board members. The ability of isolated communities to be effectively heard would amount to 0 due to the distance involved, the cost of travel, and having to compete with 23,000 or more ratepayers and projects taking place in a city ward. Representation of Banks Peninsula should have noted the fact that Akaroa suffered from COVID-19 pandemic due to the loss of international tourism. Farmers face hardship because of drought conditions. However, instead of continuing the targeted rate, Peninsula ratepayers are now expected to pay for urban stormwater drainage and flood protection and control, which unnecessarily will tax rural property owners. Akaroa's drinking water became contaminated because of slack management and oversight. But instead of providing governance and assistance to the peninsula residents, the council is set to increase funding for Christchurch, New Zealand, in a bid to attract employers to the city. There's nothing, not even a mention of Banks Peninsula. The peninsula gets higher rates overall to maintain the deteriorating status quo, and the council increases financial support to Christchurch, New Zealand in the hope of securing more industry and jobs in the city. The peninsula has a committed community board.
I don't want to interrupt, but it would be really helpful, because this is a statutory process, representation review, it's better to focus on, all of the reasons that you've set out, that you've been going through. You're straying into the LTP process, which we're heading
I'm aware
into.
of that, but these are examples of representation. And if I may say, the community board is very committed. They work very hard. Yeah. But with regard to representation, we don't have Zoom in Akaroa. I'm talking about representation of me as a ratepayer being able to communicate with a community board. Nor is it available in Little River. So it makes it very difficult for us. And in terms of representation, again, for our community of interest, for our isolated community of interest, in the council's 45-page library schedule of events, there's not one mention of Banks Peninsula. So I think the fair and equal representation of the Peninsula Ward, the topic that I'm discussing right now, really requires good governance. Otherwise, it's meaningless. So basically, I'd like to thank you for supporting the current structure of the Peninsula Ward, but the low remuneration paid to the community board representatives, instigated by the Remuneration Authority, does not recognize the time and effort needed to effectively represent Peninsula ratepayers. As discussed on Monday, the low pay, which amounts to about $780 per month, makes it virtually impossible for anyone to stand for the community board because it has become largely a volunteer effort. And I know that is not your decision. That was the local government commission. But that's one of the reasons you have low turnouts for people wanting to stand.
Yeah, it's a representation authority, and we're not allowed to take
I'm supporting
take it
you.
into account. Yeah,
I'm supporting you. But when you asked on Monday about why more people don't stand for the Peninsula Community Board, that's the reason. And it's not your jurisdiction, I know that. So thank you.
So, do you want to carry on with the?
I'll turn it over to Mike.
Yeah.
Yeah, we might take questions at the end if that's
Yes,
possible.
that'll be fine. Thank you.
Okay. Well, good morning, councillors, Madam Mayor, Deputy Mayor, Mary. Yes, thank you very much for giving us quite a generous amount of time to support the Peninsula in the representation review. I'm sure these hearings are not the most scintillating things that you as councillors have to do, and I'm pleased to say I spend quite a bit of time here complaining about things the council is doing or not doing, but today I'm here refreshingly to show some gratitude on behalf of Banks Peninsula for the fact that we do belong to Christchurch City Council. There's quite a lot of council bashing going on at the moment, and people talk of joining Selwyn, which of course is a ridiculous concept. So I believe that we're really concerned with the ominous tone of the last local government commission review, where it appeared that our representation of having one councillor and 2 community board members would be transitional, because surely the marriage has taken place, the honeymoon's over, and we can now get down to married life together. And I thought that was rather ominous, that you need our support, I believe, to explain to the local government commission why we are a very unique, if that's not bad grammar, community, and that despite our low population, we should have the representation as a minimum that we have at the moment, because it works quite well having 2 community board members and a sitting councillor who happens to be deputy mayor. I'll go on to that in a moment. I think the danger of disenfranchisement and decentralisation has got many examples I was going to share with you. Lion Breweries bought Monteith's on the west coast and decided it would be a rational decision to move production to Auckland. The west coasters rebelled, and Monteith's beer sales fell until they reversed that decision. John Carter, the mayor of Northland, pointed out that with the closure of banks, Koei, Paihia and Russell do not have a bank. Therefore, residents and business people there have to travel an hour and a half to Kerry every day to do their banking. He has implemented a campaign with all the banks to get better representation in those centres. So the same thing applies to Banks Peninsula. We have to fight hard. A good example, in the last national election, the National Party put up a candidate who was inexperienced with Peninsula matters, and as far as I could tell, didn't take the trouble to fight.
Can we please stick to the council
Right.
rather than central
You don't want examples?
politics? Yeah.
All right. I said in my last submission 2 weeks ago that Jeff Carter, the retiring service centre council manager, was the local face. And I believe that was true. We don't have one now. Now, Councillor James Daniels suggested the other day that we might like to be merged with Hallswell. And Victoria's explained why there's a big difference between Hallswell and the Peninsula. We have our own school buses, post office boxes, rural delivery, our own fire brigade. We're not a suburb with a sprawling shopping mall and a gigantic new lovely library. So, James, I'm sorry you're not here, because I was going to say I hope this is not your valedictory action on behalf
No,
of the council.
all councillors that are absent do agree that they will watch the playback. So
All right.
you can wave at the camera.
Well, I think, James, you did such a good job in supporting the purchase of Takapuniki. I don't want to go out on a sour note. And I also would like to thank the City Council for the support you gave us when we were single-handedly on the peninsula trying to get our health hub resurrected, and the permission to use the targeted rate levy, which has been an enormous success. It's raised downwards of 1.2 million. I say downwards because the continuing donation strategy we've got is bearing fruit. So thank you for that too. But I'm philosophically opposed to centralisation. That's why I brought those examples up that you wouldn't let me go on with, Leanne. And I believe that that is at the core of this. That's why I think Christchurch, New Zealand, is not the right body to be pushing the destination management strategy to represent the peninsula. I think we deserve our own, and I've mentioned this to you both, Andrew and Victor and Leanne. Peninsula people could be on that committee that makes decisions about promoting tourism. The current situation with 2 community board reps and 1 councillor at least gives us good representation, and we must not lose that. I would go mad if I didn't have access to Andrew Turner through the community board to get things done when we've got issues. If it was all left to Hereford Street here and we dial up an 0800 number or have a Zoom, it would not have the same facility, and it would end up with a further feeling of disenfranchisement. So I'd just like to conclude by reading a submission which I found very apt. Dear Council, as a resident of Akaroa, I would like to forcefully put forward that our community vitally needs the representation we have with the Christchurch City Council. We have a community board and a councillor, and we could not function well as a community with any less. Akaroa is the oldest town in the South Island and has always had some unique aspects, not only landscape. It is a special community which is very active in fighting its own corner and solving its own problems. We are now a serious tourist destination, and the council has expected its residents to accept and look after thousands of cruise ship tourists, let alone the many thousands who visit by road. This puts a great strain on a small community, and without our council representatives, we'd not be able to deal with the issues that arise from the town being host to so many visitors or able to service their needs. We are not a suburb of Christchurch, but still very much a rural community with our own identity. With the connections of the French being early colonisers in Akaroa, we have always had French names and attributes to our streets, businesses, etc. We also have Maori names and many connections, so I feel it's important that we're able to accommodate all 3, English, Maori and French. Nowhere else in New Zealand has all these 3 connections. It's important that any changes are discussed with the whole community. We are a community of unique landscapes, artistic and talented people, a farming community, tourist destination, expanding wildlife, all the attributes that a modern New Zealand strives to achieve. We already have much here. We must continue to have representation so that we can move forward to make our peninsula an even more wonderful place to live in the future and for you all to visit. That was from my wife, Patricia Dart.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Sarah, we've got 1 minute for questions. So, Sarah.
Thanks so much. I know there's a little contradiction, and there's a couple of things where you've said that the current representation works quite well. You've had it for 16 years. Don't fix it if it's not broken, kind of thing. And yet at the same time, you're saying the city doesn't understand Banks Peninsula. We're not getting what we need. All of that kind of thing. And I'm wondering if it would be better for you to have more representation by having, for example, 3 councillors, including some urban area in Banks Peninsula, all responsible for the area. And that way you would have greater buy-in around the council table for those kind of things.
Shall I do? Well, I think that's a good suggestion, except that we've got total focus with the existing arrangement of one councillor, and if we're sharing a councillor who's got other responsibilities for other wards, I'm worried that focus would be
But
lost.
if there were 3 councillors, for example, so if you had a more like the old system,
If I could answer, the distance is too great. All you have to do is ask Andrew Turner how many miles he puts on his vehicle. It's a long ways to go.
they would be able to share that between 3 and have responsibility.
But I don't know if they'd be fully informed to the same degree. Having one focused counselor is a great benefit. I'd take 2 if we could get another one.
Yeah.
But I don't see it working spread amongst the city. What I was trying to explain in my submission, representation requires good governance, which is perhaps what
Yeah, I'm
you're
just saying that you keep saying that we don't understand you enough, and I'm wondering if it's just because there's not enough councillors involved over there.
No, I think it's because there was a question on Monday about isolated communities, and I think it was from the Holswell representative from the association, who assumed that there were many isolated communities within Christchurch,
There are.
very diverse communities.
Yeah, there
That's
are.
not the same as having to drive 2 hours in a snowstorm to get to the hospital when someone's dying, which I have done in the middle of August. That is an isolated community. I wouldn't regard the situation in Christchurch as being isolated.
Look, thank you very much, and thank you both for taking the time to come over and presenting in person. The process is that we consider this, we notify a final version. If there are appeals, then those that appeal are able to submit on it. So I think those who have submitted are able to speak to the appeals. So it may be that it may be that further work isn't required. But if you are going to go in front of the Local Government Commission, you've got to really focus on those issues relating to isolation. That they are the key to the fair and equitable representation under the legislation. So that's the only bit of supportive advice that I'm going to give you in terms of the next stage. But thank you very much for coming over and making your submissions.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tony Simon.